Hello and welcome to class 22, where we will be discussing believing to belong and the novice expert problem. We will also be discussing epistemic bubbles and echo chambers. In some ways, these topics are lead-ins to the themes of the final section, which is about in-group epistemic distortion and the tactics of bad faith actors. I will be discussing what that means at the end of this video. For now, I want to talk about these issues as they relate to the topic of this section, which is reasoning with sources. We began this section by looking at arguments from authority, that is, situations where you are asked to believe something on someone's say-so. In these situations, where the people you are relying on are experts in a technical field, the novice expert problem arises. Basically, the problem is just that you, a novice, can't evaluate the expertise of the expert without becoming an expert yourself. The methods for evaluating arguments from authority we talked about in class 18 are the beginnings of a way around this problem. But sometimes people are unable to correctly evaluate the testimony of experts for a variety of reasons related to the way they identify themselves as members of different groups. And if they identify themselves with as members of a group that sets itself off from those experts, this can be the beginning of a problem. And this is where the issue of believing to belong and echo chambers comes in. So I'm going to start by talking about the reading we had from Helene de Cruz, Believing to Belong. De Cruz begins by introducing the novice expert problem, which they defined this way. Non-experts need to be able to evaluate the reliability of experts, but they don't have the skills to do so. De Cruz, by the way, uses they-them pronouns. This is a problem we all face because we are all novices in most things. De Cruz also points out that normally people avoid the novice expert problem by using indirect measures of reliability, like reputation and internal consistency. This corresponds roughly to our critical questions for arguments from authority. Internal consistency specifically relates to the third critical question for arguments from authority: does this fit with everything else we know? We can also use our partial knowledge of a field to evaluate reliability here. Like if someone says that a predicted eclipse is a sign that people on Earth have been sinful, you can say, I don't think eclipses work that way. Because even though you don't know much about astronomy, you do know that eclipses are caused by the moon passing in front of the sun. Most of the time, this kind of reasoning, the kind of reasoning we outlined in our critical questions for arguments from authority, is adequate. However, in certain circumstances, we run into a problem that de Cruz labels denialism. Cruz defines denialism this way: the refusal to believe in facts and theories for which there is a high degree of scientific consensus. The examples they use are vaccine denialism, climate change denialism, and evolution denialism. It's worth noting that the origin of the term denialism is not actually from any of these sciences, but from the study of history. The original denialism was Holocaust denialism, the refusal to believe that the Nazis murdered 6 million Jews, along with Roma, gay people, and other people they despised. But actually, the pattern here mirrored the pattern with denialism about these more contemporary scientific issues, because what the Holocaust denialists did is reject concrete empirical evidence of an actual event, and they did this out of motivations very similar to the denialists about scientific issues, as we will now see. So, de Cruz wants to emphasize that in a lot of these situations, there is more at stake than just the evidence. People have what they call non-epistemic reasons for belief. So these are just motivations for accepting a belief that are unrelated to the truth of the belief or the evidence for that belief. And um, you may think that well, you may think that this is automatically irrational, but it is something that we all take part in because there are lots of groups that we are a part of where there is actually belief requirements for being a member of the group. And that's going to be a strong motivation, really, for anyone, right? Non epistemic reasons for belief are ubiquitous and influential on us all. But they do, in fact, don't point us towards true beliefs. They point us just as much towards false beliefs, because by definition, they are non epistemic. They aren't related to the evidence. Um, Another important thing to think about is the social signaling function of belief. When you're in a group that has belief requirements for membership, um, the demonstrations of that belief become a way of signaling group membership, right? And so people will get really loud about the beliefs that make them a member of the group to show how much they belong to the group. And again, this is not something that is limited to, for instance, religious contexts. People go along with the group all the time. And so the Cruz talks about the Ash conformity experiments. And I'm just going to summarize them here. Basically, uh, a group of people were asked to judge um, which two lines were the same length, right? So you're just given what seems like an obvious question here. The line on the left is the same length as line C on the right. And so you're in a group of people, and you think everyone in your group is a part of this experiment where you're asked to judge the lengths of lines. But as it turns out, all but one of the people in your group are actors. You're the only one who's in the group who's not an actor. And so on one round, all the other people in the group give the wrong answer to the question. They say that the line on the left is the same length as line B, for instance. This must be a curious situation to find yourself in. But about a quarter of the time, people will just agree with everyone around them and not with their own eyes that are clearly telling them that the line on the left is the same length as line C, right? Um, and often they will just be open about the fact that they were just doing this to go along. So the subjects who yield believe the wrong answer? No, they gave the wrong answer to get along with everyone else. Um, so this is another one of these psychological experiments that were popular starting in the 50s and continued on to the 70s that were based on deception in one way or another. And we've drawn on these a fair amount, actually, in this course. Some of Festinger's work relied on deception, for instance. But they just got more and more out of hand. And so this is a parody article from The Onion that suggests that the majority of psychological experiments conducted in the 70s were just crimes. And the picture here is an allusion to the Stanford prison experiment, which um, uh, called on actors to play the role of guards and prisoners, and people just got too into the role and got abusive. Although some people now say that no one was actually getting too into the role and getting abusive, they were just play acting for the experimenters. The point is, by the 1970s, all these experiments based on deception had just gotten out of hand. And I laughed at the last line of the Onion article. The report went on to mention that the remaining 21% of experiments, while not rising to the level of crimes, we're still flat out racist. That's a parody, but it's kind of close to the truth. De Cruz also discusses Henrik and Boyd on conformist transmission of belief. So already we've started to see that people believe things for non-epistemic reasons. For instance, to show that they're a member of a group. And actually, there's a reason people do this. Henrik and Boyd suggest that holding the same beliefs as the rest of your group is evolutionarily adaptive, even when the belief is false. So think about our brains. Our brains are evolved organs. And 150,000 years ago, when the cognitive architecture of our brains was emerging, we learned to work together to survive in all sorts of different kinds of environments. And being able to all do the same thing allowed us to survive. And group belief helps coordinate action. So if we all believe the same thing, we can act together. And that is still useful even if what we believe isn't exactly correct, right? Another thing that happens is, cooperation requires a lot of solidarity. You need to really trust the people around you. And unusual beliefs can actually reinforce group identity more than other things. So you think about beliefs such as Jehovah's Witnesses not refusing blood transfusions. Among other things, holding this belief shows that you're really serious about belonging to the group, right? And so this is true for a lot of groups that have really um, um, unusual beliefs. Flat earthers. If you're a part of a flat earth online community where everyone believes in the flat earth idea, you can now signal how serious you are, how much you love this group by walking around and telling everyone that you're a flat earther and facing the consequences of that, because most people will look down on you for that. And the advantage is that you can really, really show that you are true to your group. And this also, I think, shows that confirmation bias is, an evolutionary adaptation. It allows us to stay with our current beliefs and rely on each other to continue to stay with, uh, uh, rely on other people to continue to stay with their beliefs. And so we can plan out and coordinate action over time. If we are always seeing evidence that reinforces our beliefs. Confirmation bias steers us, keeps us on beliefs that might be false, but they help coordinate action. So all this leads to De Cruz's theory of denialism. People have non-epistemic reasons for belief. That is, reasons for believing that aren't actually evidence for that belief. Group membership is an example. People belong to groups that have belief requirements for membership. Religion is a common example here. To be a member of a religion, you generally have to have certain beliefs about God. But having unusual beliefs is an especially good way of reinforcing group membership. If your group believes something odd, then proudly stating that belief can signal that you are a loyal member of that group. Science denialism fits this pattern well. So this kind of believing to belong becomes another factor in what we will, at the end of this video, be presenting under the name in-group epistemic distortion. This is a general term for what happens when a tight-knit group holds a belief radically at odds with the evidence. But first, I want to talk about the other reading we had today, Thi Nguyen on epistemic bubbles and echo chambers. So to discuss Nguyen's essay, I'm going to switch back to a video I recorded earlier that starts with a tweet that I thought was funny and appropriate.
Bama fangirl tweeted, "Y'all remember before the internet that people thought the cause of stupidity was a lack of access to information? Yeah, it wasn't that." Now, I'm old enough that I remember, in fact, the tech boom of the 90s, all of the promises made about human enlightenment that would be brought about by access to information. And well, yeah, that hasn't happened. And some of that was predictable because access to information is also access to disinformation. But it turns out that, well, simply trying to promulgate the tools of distinguishing information from disinformation haven't been adequate because we don't really understand why people are drawn to disinformation unless we use the tools of social epistemology. So this essay by Nguyen was one of the first essays that really began to convince me that this was an important issue to pursue and to use in shaping my classes. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about the difference between epistemic bubbles and echo chambers and outlining Nguyen's main argument that our current problems are caused by echo chambers and not epistemic bubbles. Another thing I'm going to be doing is, in this video, is discussing how to tell if you are in an echo chamber and looking critically at some of Nguyen's thoughts on how people can get out of echo chambers. So the first main insight of Nguyen's paper is that there's a difference between epistemic bubbles and echo chambers, and that a lot of people writing about current political conflicts have not distinguished these two ideas when they really, really need to. Basically, an epistemic bubble is a situation where a person holds a false belief because they don't come into contact with opposing viewpoints or information that contradict their views. So just remember, the definition of epistemology is the study of knowledge, what it is and how to get it. We've been talking about social epistemology, so that's the study of how in groups we acquire knowledge or fail to acquire knowledge. So an epistemic bubble is a knowledge bubble, an information bubble. And so complaints about information bubbles is the sort of thing that you see a lot of people writing about social media voicing. One of our main the claim is that our main social media feeds are all tailored to our politics, and so we never get to hear other voices, other sides of the debate, and that makes us polarized, and that is why people claim so many people are angry all the time. Nguyen points out that this is actually very different than an echo chamber. In an echo chamber, people do hear voices from the other side, but they discount them because they don't trust them. The problems that we are facing really come from echo chambers, not epistemic bubbles. So bottom line, an epistemic bubble is when you don't hear the people from the other side. An echo chamber is what happens when you don't trust people from the other side. Most people writing on contemporary politics aren't making this distinction, so that they think people are in epistemic bubbles when they really are in echo chambers. A lot of what Nguyen is doing here is drawing on a 2008 book by Jameson and Capella that's called Echo Chamber. It is about Rush Limbaugh and right-wing media in general. And the book documents how people like Limbaugh and Fox News systematically cultivate distrust in other news and information sources. They don't isolate people from these sources, however. They and their followers routinely read and quote people who disagree with them, but they do this in order to denounce them as liars and deceivers. So again, the issue here isn't about contact, it's about a lack of trust. And one of the things that actually happens here is the development of what Nguyen labels a disagreement reinforcement mechanism. That's fancy. It's got some other names. But the basic idea here is that if you really want to get people loyal to you and distrustful of other people, you want to give them a set of beliefs that will make them treat any contradictory evidence as more evidence for their own worldview. So what they say is that Limbaugh says, the liberal media is going to lie to you. This is a thing the liberal media is saying. This is a lie. And so when his followers encounter these statements, it actually proves Limbaugh correct, because he made this prediction about how the liberal media would distort their views. And this is something that actually, this kind of reinforcement mechanism is something that you see all over the place. So you can imagine members of a religious group. In fact, many religious groups will warn their members about outsiders who are trying to tempt them or undermine their faith. Sometimes this process is called evidential preemption. You are essentially trying to inoculate your followers against the negative evidence that they are going to encounter in the world. And social psychology tells us that there are all sorts of mechanisms that people have that cause them to double down on their current beliefs in the face of negative evidence. Because after all, encountering negative evidence, admitting you're wrong, is painful. So rather than admit you're wrong, you double down on your false beliefs. And then disagreement reinforcement mechanisms are tools that you can use to win loyalty by exploiting these features of people's psychology. Sometimes, I should say, Nguyen links this to cults. I actually don't like the language of cult. I think there are abusive things that happen in religious contexts, but they are just as likely to happen in mainline religions as they are in new emerging religions and religions that seem odd to mainline people. So I rather than talking about cults, I much prefer to talk about religious abuse. And the use of disagreement reinforcement mechanisms happens in religious abuse situations, both in mainstream religions and in unusual religions. Okay, so an echo chamber. Actually, in this version of the article, Nguyen creates a more detailed definition of an echo chamber. This article is actually an extension of a more popular article that he wrote for the online magazine Eon. This one extends it and makes it more academic, more suitable for a college audience rather than a popular audience. The original article is called "Why It's as Hard to Escape an Echo Chamber as It Is to Escape a Cult." But in any case, one of the things he adds in this extended version is a more detailed look at what it means to be in an echo chamber. And so the basic property is the first one that I list here. An echo chamber creates a significant disparity of distrust between members and non-members, right? You are in an echo chamber if there's a group of people that you systematically distrust that are outside of your group. And the echo chamber will exclude non-members through epistemic discrediting, that is, saying that they're not trustworthy. while simultaneously amplifying the member's epistemic credentials. So the constant message in an echo chamber is, you cannot trust outsiders, but you can trust us absolutely. And another important feature here is that this echo chambers work for groups where having certain beliefs is a prerequisite for membership in the group. So you can think about how, there are all sorts of different human groups out there. And some of them you just belong to whether you like it or not, and it doesn't matter what you believe. So racial groups are like that. If you are born black or white, everyone is going to categorize you. You can try and opt out of it, but you'll get a lot of resistance, and there are no belief requirements for being in the group. Religions, on the other hand, typically have belief requirements for being in them, and so do echo chambers, right? And the unique thing about echo chambers is that not only are there beliefs that you have to be in the group, but those very beliefs are the things that amplify the distrust between in-group members and out-group members. So if you're, so you can think about this in a religious context. If your religious sect teaches that you've got things to learn from members of all religions, then that's not a disagreement reinforcement mechanism. That's not an echo chamber. That is a sign that you're not in a dysfunctional or abusive context. Whereas if it becomes core to being a member of your religion that you distrust members of other religions, that is a sign of, among other things, religious abuse, but also an echo chamber. So I think actually this gives us the first hint on how we can tell when we are in an echo chamber. Nguyen mentions that echo chambers can create runaway credence levels for approved individuals. That's kind of fancy, but what that just means is the reinforcement mechanisms lead you to trust the leaders more and more and more, and eventually you wind up having infinite trust in them. In healthy epistemic communities, that is, healthy communities of knowers, there is something like an upper ceiling on the credence level afforded to any individual. That is, there's an upper limit to how much you're ever going to put your boundless faith in someone, right? Any one individual. And this is because your trust in other people as sources of knowledge is spread widely across many different kinds of individuals, and this allows you to get input from many different kinds of individuals, and more importantly, to be willing to consider it fairly. So that's the difference between epistemic bubbles and echo chambers. The next step is to understand why echo chambers and not epistemic bubbles are the major problem we're facing. But before we do that, we need to say a little bit about how epistemic bubbles and echo chambers are broken down, are gotten rid of. I'll be returning to this at the end of the video when I have more to say about escaping an echo chamber. But right now, I just want to provide the initial contrast, right? So basically, to pop an epistemic bubble, all you need to do is expose people to the required information, the outside sources that they haven't been previously exposed to. To get rid of an echo chamber, you need to do something far more complicated. You need to rebuild trust. Actually, I think Nguyen is a little optimistic when he says that all you need to do to pop an epistemic bubble is expose people to outside information. Because there are things that are not a part of echo chambers that keep us clinging to false beliefs that we've already established. And the big one here is just confirmation bias. So you are going to be subject to confirmation bias even if you're not in an echo chamber, right? Confirmation bias is just your tendency to ignore evidence that doesn't fit with what you already believe. The echo chamber is a social structure that is constantly reinforcing your natural confirmation bias. But even in the absence of an echo chamber, you're still going to be subject to confirmation bias. Nevertheless, I think Nguyen is basically right that it is significantly easier to pop an epistemic bubble than it is to escape an echo chamber, because in an echo chamber you've got all of those individual factors like confirmation bias that are being exploited and reinforced by the leadership of the group that you are in. To break through an echo chamber, you need to rebuild trust. You can't just this can't be done with information, it can't be done with argument. Ultimately, and this is why I think this is a problem for critical thinking courses, it can't be done with reason alone. And so Nguyen relies on one particular story of a white supremacist who was deprogrammed, essentially weaned away from his white supremacist upbringing by consistent, persistent, generous outreach by Jewish people at his college. There are other stories that in other situations that are very similar. So there's during the early part of the 21st century, during the aughts, there was a lot of research, not a lot, there was some research on deprogramming Islamic radicals. This was obviously something that the U.S. government had a big interest in. And the consistent result was that you needed to give people something emotionally that replaces what belief in violent jihad used to do for them. This is actually, and this is true for conspiracy theories. It's true for QAnon. You need to address why people are drawn into these radical beliefs and social structures, right? So you need to rebuild trust, and that is hard. So epistemic bubbles are easier to pop than echo chambers. Why do we think our current problems are caused by echo chambers? Well, actually, all of the stuff that that Nguyen used to introduce the idea of echo chambers applies right away here, right? Rush Limbaugh has been or was a major political figure for decades, and he still exerts a big influence after his death. But all the stuff we heard from Jameson and Capella tells us that Limbaugh's followers regularly read but do not accept liberal news sources. So if the problem were merely an epistemic bubble, plus perhaps some confirmation bias, that would have been collapsed. But that's not what we see. And what Jameson and Capella observed for Limbaugh has been observed on other platforms as well, right? So new Facebook data, in fact, does seem to show that people on Facebook do see information from the other side, and people often visit websites with an opposite political affiliation. And there's a citation to that that I've got here that you can click on if you download the PowerPoint. So what we're seeing here is not an interruption in the flow of information. It is a lack of trust. And we can go ahead and now put this argument in standard form, right? Epistemic bubbles can be popped by exposure to contradictory evidence and argument. Facebook users, that's premise one. Premise two, Facebook users and Rush Limbaugh fans are routinely exposed to contradictory evidence and arguments. Premise three, Facebook users and Rush Limbaugh fans remain politically polarized. Conclusion, Facebook users and Rush Limbaugh fans are not trapped in epistemic bubbles. There must be something else going on, and that is the echo chamber. So, echo chambers do a better job than epistemic bubbles of explaining why so many people seem to have become irrational and ignore evidence, right? In fact, people in echo chambers are using critical reasoning. They just have distorted standards of who to trust. So, I've given examples in the past where it looks like people are making crazy inferences. For instance, I talked about the QAnon followers who believed that they were exposed to anthrax. But this is actually an example of the use of critical reasoning if you recognize that they are completely wedded to the premise that COVID is fake, right? So the problem is not a failure to reason, but bad relationships of trust that then distort the process of reasoning. And there's another point that Nguyen makes that I think is worth thinking about. Echo chambers don't use Orwellian doublespeak. So I don't know if you were made to read 1984 or any George Orwell in high school or other classes. I recommend that you do. It's great stuff. Orwell spends a lot of time criticizing bureaucratic language for hiding atrocities, and in particular, he's thinking about Stalin and Hitler. Hiding atrocities behind nice words, right? Orwellian doublespeak. But we don't see Orwellian doublespeak in the current environment coming from the radicalized sources. The radicalized sources state clearly who can be trusted and who can't. And so in the past, I've used Orwell in this course, and I've talked about how a lot of the language around immigrant detention is examples of Orwellian doublespeak. But I don't believe that is the problem when we are looking at vaccine denial or QAnon or similar right-wing movements.
So now I want to transition to the next section of this course, which is about in-group epistemic distortion and the tactics of bad faith actors. So far in this class, we've been talking about factors that interfere with our ability to recognize experts and reason well with arguments from authority. We talked about how feelings of group membership can get you to cling to unjustified beliefs, and how cult leaders and similar people can poison you against believing legitimate experts. I want to pay attention now to the people who are leading you away from legitimate experts, the tactics they use, and the situations they set up. I am labeling these situations in-group epistemic distortion. In discussing this, we are now thoroughly in the realm of social epistemology. Remember at the outset, I said that there were three main ways to study critical thinking. The traditional philosophical way, which focuses on arguments, the psychological way, which focuses on cognitive biases, and the methods of social epistemology. Social epistemology is the study of the way we work together in groups as critical thinkers to create knowledge, or alternately fail to work together and wind up creating ignorance. So let's now turn to the idea of in-group epistemic distortion. You can think of in-group epistemic distortion roughly as being groupthink. But people use the term groupthink in all sorts of ways. And I want to have a term that is inclusive of the variety of phenomena that I think come together when you have a group of people that are not functioning together as critical thinkers. So I define in-group epistemic distortion as a collection of misleading arguments, cognitive biases, and abusive social strategies that cause groups of people to adopt and stick to radically unjustified beliefs. So here's a graphic that illustrates in a somewhat emotional manner all the things that come together to create in-group epistemic distortion, or many of the things that come together. Some of these things are things that we just discussed in this class. Things like believing to belong, evidential preemption, and echo chambers. All of those were just discussed in this class. Others are things we've discussed in earlier classes, like confirmation bias, which came up in class 4, testimonial injustice, which came up in class 20, and identity protective cognition that came up in class 16. In the next section, I want to bring in more factors that have this effect and also talk about the tactics that individuals can use if they are not acting as critical thinkers but acting selfishly to exploit these phenomena. And all of this creates what I'm going to call in-group epistemic distortion, which leads you to a group of people who all hold beliefs that are radically unjustified by the evidence. Now, you might be thinking in this case, how do I know I'm not in one of these bubbles? I mean, it's easy enough to look at someone else's group and say, "Oh gosh, you are all clearly in a cult and believe something weird." But how do I know I'm not the one who is wrong? Well, that actually forces us to go back to the original tactics of the philosophical approach to critical thinking and good arguments, including deductive arguments, inductive arguments, arguments by analogy, arguments um, using generalizations, arguments from testimony, that sort of thing. In any case, all of that is for the next section, where we will be focusing on in-group epistemic distortion and the tactics of bad faith actors.